In our last investigation beneath an inactive U.S. military site in Alaska, a sealed underground tunnel was identified, a structure that didn't match any standard Cold War base design. What mattered wasn't what was found inside it, but who it was never meant for. The tunnel wasn't for soldiers, it was for something else. Most military tunnels are designed around one assumption: that people will move through them. They are built for boots, equipment, and repetition. Straight lines, predictable spacing, lighting placed at human intervals, handrails where fatigue is expected, signage where hesitation might occur. That assumption breaks down the moment you look closely at the tunnel beneath the Alaska base, because nothing about it suggests it was meant to be used by soldiers. Not regularly, not safely, not for long. In the base investigation, what stood out wasn't what was found underground. It was what wasn't there. No personnel, markings, no directional indicators, no staging areas, no evidence of repeated foot traffic, and most importantly, no tolerance for error. Military tunnels meant for troops are forgiving by design. They assume exhaustion. They assume panic. They assume mistakes. This tunnel didn't. The corridor sloped downward at a constant subtle angle, not steep enough to notice immediately, but persistent enough to change depth over time. That kind of design doesn't help soldiers. It disorients them. It shifts pressure. It alters airflow. And airflow matters. In human-rated underground spaces, ventilation prioritizes comfort and oxygen distribution. In containment or isolation corridors, airflow prioritizes control, pressure differentials, directional flow, separation. This tunnel followed the second logic. Even the power routing hinted at it. Electricity was present where it shouldn't have been, deep beneath inactive upper systems. That's not redundancy for convenience. That's redundancy for persistence. Something needed to remain operational, even if the rest of the base went dark. Then there's the access logic. The tunnel wasn't sealed from the inside, the way abandoned personnel routes usually are. It was sealed to prevent entry, not exit. Welds placed where opening would be difficult, but monitoring lines left intact. That's not abandonment. That's restriction. Soldier tunnels are documented. Even classified ones leave structural fingerprints. Standardized widths, NATO-aligned measurements, repeatable layouts. This one didn't match any of them. It didn't match U.S. Army templates. It didn't match Air Force logistics corridors. It didn't even resemble Cold War missile silo access routes. It was narrower where it shouldn't have been, wider where nothing human would need space. Which raises the first uncomfortable question. If this tunnel wasn't designed for soldiers to move through, then what was it designed for? And more importantly, what was it designed to separate? Because underground military infrastructure almost always serves one of two purposes: movement or isolation. And this tunnel failed every test for movement. That leaves only one remaining category. Isolation systems are built around containment, not occupancy. They assume minimal human presence. They assume automation. They assume long periods without oversight. They are not meant to be visited. They are meant to remain. And when something underground is designed to remain, even after a base is shut down, it changes the meaning of everything built above it. This tunnel wasn't a support structure. It was the reason the base existed at all. Why soldiers were kept out. The most revealing detail about the Alaska tunnel wasn't its depth or its power. It was the language used around it. Access denied. Do not re-enter. Clearance required. Those phrases don't appear on infrastructure meant for routine military use. They appear on systems where human presence is considered a liability. In Cold War design doctrine, there was a sharp distinction between spaces operated by soldiers and spaces protected from them. The first category assumes training, discipline, rotation. The second assumes mistakes, curiosity, and eventual exposure. This tunnel was clearly in the second category. In personnel-rated underground facilities, access control is layered but permissive. Multiple checkpoints, yes, but also redundancy for evacuation, signage for orientation, and procedural flexibility. Soldiers are expected to move through those spaces under stress. Here, the logic was reversed. Entry points were limited, not staged. Controls were centralized, not distributed. And critically, the sealing methods favored irreversibility. Welded barriers aren't meant to stop intruders. They're meant to stop authorized people from changing their minds. If a commander decides to reopen a sealed troop corridor, bolts can be removed, plates can be cut, procedures exist. Welds remove that discretion. They force escalation. They create paperwork. They leave evidence. That's deliberate. It means whoever designed this system did not want local command, or even regional command, to make decisions about access. This wasn't about keeping enemies out. It was about keeping decision-making upstream. Another clue lies in how denial was implemented. There was no attempt to disguise the tunnel's existence. It wasn't hidden behind false walls or decoy infrastructure. It was simply rendered unusable, then left visible to those who knew where to look. That suggests confidence. Confidence that even if discovered, it wouldn't be entered. Confidence that even if entered, it wouldn't be understood. Cold War containment systems often relied on this principle. Ambiguity as protection. If a space is confusing enough, dangerous enough, or officially unexplained enough, most personnel will self-restrict, and soldiers are trained to obey uncertainty. The warning language matters here, not because of what it says, but because of what it doesn't. There were no references to weapons, no references to radiation, no references to structural collapse. Those are the usual deterrents. Instead, the language focused on authorization and time, dates, clearance status, procedural prohibitions. That points to a system governed not by immediate physical danger, but by policy risk. In other words, the danger wasn't that soldiers would die. The danger was that they would know. This aligns with a broader Cold War pattern. Certain facilities were intentionally separated from normal chains of command. They were managed as systems, not locations. Access wasn't about rank. It was about role. If you didn't have a reason to be there, the system assumed you were the risk. Which explains another oddity: the lack of contingency planning for human presence. No fallback lighting, no comfort ventilation, no sustained occupancy support. The tunnel doesn't fail safely. It fails conclusively. That tells us something important. Whatever this tunnel was part of, it wasn't something soldiers were meant to manage. It wasn't even something they were meant to respond to. It was something meant to continue, regardless of who was on duty above it. And when a system is designed to operate independently of people, especially soldiers, it stops being military infrastructure in the traditional sense. It becomes something else entirely. In the next part, we'll examine why this tunnel was never officially sealed, and why, in Cold War logic, sealing something permanently can be more dangerous than leaving it accessible under strict control. Why it was never sealed. If this tunnel was considered dangerous, restricted, and unsuitable for soldiers, the logical, Question follows immediately. Why wasn't it sealed permanently? Cold War military doctrine had no shortage of ways to erase infrastructure. Shafts were collapsed, corridors were flooded, access points were buried and logged as environmental hazards. That didn't happen here. Instead, what we see is something far more deliberate: controlled closure. The difference matters. A permanently sealed tunnel is a dead system. A controlled access tunnel is a system that is expected to remain relevant. In Cold War planning, certain facilities were never meant to be shut down in the conventional sense. They were placed into what planners called latent status, inactive, unstaffed, but structurally and electrically preserved. This tunnel fits that category precisely. Power was still routed into it even when upper-level systems were inactive. That alone eliminates abandonment. Maintaining power underground in Arctic conditions is expensive, technically difficult, and unnecessary unless continuity is required. You don't keep a system alive accidentally. More telling is how it was left accessible. The entrance wasn't collapsed. It wasn't obscured. It wasn't erased from the physical layout. It was sealed in a way that preserved the tunnel's internal environment while preventing casual entry. That's not how you bury a mistake. That's how you preserve an asset. Cold War containment philosophy operated on a paradox. Some things were considered too dangerous to destroy, not because they were volatile, but because destroying them created uncertainty. If a system has unknown secondary effects, you don't dismantle it. You isolate it, monitor it, and keep the option to intervene. Permanent sealing removes that option. Another factor is jurisdiction. Certain projects were managed outside normal military command structures. When those projects ended, responsibility didn't disappear. It fragmented. Multiple agencies, overlapping authorities, and legal ambiguity made decisive action risky. Sealing a tunnel permanently requires sign-off. Leaving it restricted does not. That distinction allowed responsibility to remain distributed, and therefore deniable. There's also the issue of documentation. A permanently sealed structure must be recorded as such. Environmental surveys, geological impact reports, long-term risk assessments, all of these create paper trails. A restricted access system can exist in a gray zone, known to exist, not officially closed, not officially active. That gray zone is where many Cold War systems were intentionally left. But the most important reason the tunnel was never sealed lies in its design purpose. Containment systems are not static. They rely on monitoring, adjustment, and occasional intervention. Even if no one is expected to enter regularly, access must remain possible. Sealing it permanently would signal finality. And Cold War planners avoided finality whenever possible, because finality assumes certainty, and uncertainty was the one thing they never trusted. Which leads to a deeper implication. If the tunnel was never sealed because it might need to be accessed again, then whatever it was associated with was not considered resolved. It was considered managed. In the next part, we'll examine the evacuation logic, not where people were meant to go, but why evacuation routes existed at all in a tunnel that wasn't designed for human use. Evacuation without escape. At first glance, the presence of evacuation logic in this tunnel seems contradictory. If the tunnel wasn't designed for soldiers, and if access was tightly restricted, then why did evacuation routes exist at all? The answer lies in a misunderstanding of what evacuation meant during the Cold War. Evacuation does not always mean leaving danger. Sometimes it means moving danger. In personnel-focused facilities, Evacuation routes are designed around speed, clarity, and outward flow. They move people away from a threat toward safety, daylight, or dispersal points. This tunnel followed none of those principles. The routes associated with it didn't lead outward in any obvious way. They didn't trend toward surface exits or open terrain. Instead, they curved, narrowed, and descended, away from the operational base above. That alone tells us evacuation here wasn't about saving personnel. It was about segregation. Cold War planners frequently built what were effectively internal evacuation paths, routes intended to move a limited number of individuals, materials, or system components away from populated areas and into controlled zones. These routes were not for mass movement. They were for containment under motion. This explains the lack of signage and guidance. Anyone using these routes would already know where they were going. There was no expectation of confusion, panic, or crowds. Evacuation assumes familiarity. Escape assumes urgency. This tunnel assumed neither. Another clue lies in the directionality of the airflow and structural reinforcement. In evacuation corridors meant for people, airflow assists movement and visibility. Here, airflow appears designed to isolate sections from one another, preventing pressure equalization. That is not a human comfort choice. That is a contamination control choice, which reframes the entire concept of evacuation in this context. If something needed to be moved or isolated further, the tunnel allowed it to be done without exposing the base above. That could include materials, equipment, or even specific personnel under extraordinary conditions. Cold War doctrine often treated individuals not as evacuees, but as variables. Scientists, operators, or subjects could be relocated internally to prevent wider exposure. That doesn't require wide corridors or emergency lighting. It requires control. It also explains why the evacuation logic appears incomplete. Routes exist, but they don't resolve cleanly. They branch, terminate, or narrow beyond comfortable passage. This suggests evacuation was never meant to be successful in the traditional sense. It was meant to be sufficient to delay, sufficient to isolate, sufficient to prevent escalation above ground. And that raises an uncomfortable possibility. If evacuation routes were designed not to save lives, but to preserve containment, then the tunnel wasn't a secondary structure. It was the final layer, a place where unresolved risk could be moved deeper, not eliminated. In Cold War systems, that was often considered success. In the final part, we'll look at the tunnel's design itself, and why it failed to match any known military standard, suggesting it was never intended to be replicated, improved, or fully understood. A design that was never meant to be copied. One final detail separates this tunnel from conventional military infrastructure. It doesn't follow a standard. Cold War military construction was obsessive about repetition. If something worked, it was duplicated. If it was risky, it was standardized even more tightly. That's how control is maintained at scale. This tunnel breaks that rule. Its dimensions don't align with known U.S. Army engineering templates. Its slope ratios don't match Air Force logistics corridors. Its reinforcement pattern doesn't resemble missile silo access shafts or radar maintenance tunnels. And perhaps most telling, it doesn't resemble anything that was ever built twice. Standard military design exists so that systems can be understood, trained on, and replaced. Non-standard design exists for a different reason: to prevent transfer of knowledge. When a structure is unique, the expertise required to build, operate, or modify it remains limited to a small group. Once that group dissolves, the system becomes effectively frozen in time. That appears to be exactly what happened here. This tunnel shows signs of being engineered around a single use case, not a mission type, not a class of facilities, a specific problem. That explains why it doesn't optimize for comfort, longevity, or even maintainability. It optimizes for function under constraint. It also explains why no later improvements were made. You don't upgrade systems you don't want future planners to understand. Cold War history is full of projects that were deliberately designed as dead ends. Solutions that solved an immediate concern, but were never meant to evolve. Once their purpose was fulfilled, they were isolated, documented minimally, and left intact. Not because they were successful, but because revisiting them would raise questions no one wanted to answer. This tunnel fits that pattern. It wasn't a prototype. It wasn't a failed experiment. And it wasn't infrastructure in the traditional sense. It was a response, a structural answer to a classified problem that existed briefly, intensely, and then disappeared from official memory. And that is why the tunnel wasn't meant for soldiers. Soldiers rotate, commanders change, wars end. But whatever required this tunnel was never assumed to end cleanly. So it was buried, restricted, powered, and left just accessible enough to intervene, but never enough to understand fully. Because the most dangerous thing about certain Cold War systems was not what they did, it was what they implied.